welcome to the fourth plenary session, the T.S. Papola Memorial Lecture. Professor Papola was a well-known development economist with over 4 decades of experience in teaching, research, and advisory assignments. He specialized in the areas of labor and employment, developing planning, industrial economies, regional development, and enterprise development. He taught at the universities of Lucknow and Bombay, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and University of Cambridge, UK. He was an advisor with Planning Commission, Government of India for 8 years. He worked as head, Mountain Enterprises and Infrastructure Division at International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, Integrated Mountain Development, Kathmandu for 6.5 years, where he was responsible for developing and carrying out a program of studies and documentation, consultation and advisory services in enterprise development in the mountain areas of Bhutan, China, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. Dr. Papola wrote extensively in the areas of his specialization. He published 14 books and over 18 research papers in reputed journals. He also edited a 10-volume series on labor regulation in Indian industry. Dr. Papola was chairman, member of several state and national level bodies, He was also a member of the National Commission on Enterprises in Unorganized Sector, appointed by Government of India, and member of the Prime Minister Advisory Council on Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises. Dr. Papola was president of the Indian Economic Association for the years 2005-2006. He was awarded the V.K.R.V. Rao Young Social Scientist Prize for outstanding contribution in economics in 1984. He was closely associated with the Indian Society of Labour Economics almost throughout his academic career. In the formative years of the society, he worked closely with his teacher, Dr. V.B. Singh. He worked with the society in several capacities as Joint Secretary, Honorary Secretary, and the President of the society for close to 35 years. This lecture is being organized in his memory to celebrate his works. The lecture is being delivered by Dr. Rajat Kathuria. He's Dean and Professor of Economics, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shiv Nadar University. I invite Dr. Kathuria to grace the dais. The lecture is being chaired by Professor Rakesh Basant. He's former professor, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He's an eminent economist. He is the JSW Chair Professor of Innovation and Public Policy since October 2016. He was also a member of the Satcha Committee, which wrote the report on the conditions of Muslims in India. He has contributed immensely to several areas such as public policy, technology, innovation, agriculture, etc. He has also delivered invited lectures in several US and European universities, including Yale, Princeton, Pennsylvania, Stanford, Berkeley, and the London Business School. Sir, it is my honor to invite you on the dais.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and privilege to be part of T.S. Papola Memorial Lecture. Professor Papola has been a person who's probably one of the most warm person I know. Professor Papola worked at Ahmedabad. I also worked there, but we were not there together. Professor Papola worked at Sardar Patel Institute. I also worked there, but we were not there together. But throughout our interactions over the years, the warmth that I felt while interacting with him was immense. And I fondly remember him for all the conversations that we have had. I was probably part of the SPI family, and that's the reason why I was treated like family. One thing which all of us who have interacted with Professor Papola would remember would be his sense of humor. He had a very, very good sense of humor, and you will never know when he will crack a joke, and you realize after some time that it was on you or on somebody else. So I'm very happy that I'm standing here before you to commemorate his memory. We have a very eminent speaker to deliver the memorial lecture, Professor Rajat Kathuria. He's going to speak on India's jobs dilemma. Will technology provide or divide? He doesn't need much introduction. He's currently the Dean of School of Humanities and Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at the Shiv Nadar University. He was with ICRIAR earlier. He got his undergrad degree from St. Stephen's College and a master's from Delhi School, and did his PhD at the University of Maryland. And he has worked on a large variety of issues. Since we are running late, I will not dwell on that much. I request Dr. Kathuria to deliver the lecture. Thank you.
Let me thank ISLE, IIHT, Professor Alak Sharma, and all the sort of board members of IIHT for entrusting me with this honor. I think it's a great honor to be able to deliver this T.S. Papola Memorial Lecture. And as Rakesh said, that we are already running late, so I'm going to start right away. And but before I start, I have to make some acknowledgements. And those acknowledgements are that this lecture and this paper that I'm going to write, it's still work in progress. Despite repeated calls by Professor Alak Sharma, I was unable to complete the paper before and make it into a booklet that so many of you did, but I promise that I'm going to work on this and complete this. So there is a handout, and acknowledgements for this are largely due to Radhika, who's sitting here, my former colleague from ICRIAR, and a lot of this, though she's not responsible for any of the bloomers that I make, but she's helped me immensely with this. And of course, I'm not going to refer to ILO during the talk, but ILO, Ajit Ghosh, the late Professor Ajit Ghosh, who I've referred to as well while thinking about the issues that I'm going to discuss in this lecture. So, and there are several other acknowledgements, but I think these were the main ones. So the topic is sort of will technology provide or divide? And I've sort of taken inspiration from a paper that many years ago was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which said the technology provide or the digital provide. It appeared in, I think, the early 2000s and showed the immense increase in consumer and producer surplus for fishermen in Kerala as a result of the introduction of mobile phones before and after, and a very sort of well-documented and a well-crafted research, I thought, because it used a natural experiment of the introduction of mobile phones and showed the increase in consumers and producer surplus and therefore, general welfare. And so with technology becoming more pervasive, that's really the sort of question that will it provide for that in those sorts of increases that we've seen in isolated circumstances for the entire country, or will it tend to divide? And it could probably do both. As I said, this is the work in progress, but it comes at a time, so this sort of pervasiveness of technology comes at a time in India when the background you're all familiar with, but just to sort of mention it for sake of form and for completeness, India's jobs problem or jobs conundrum, as it's often been called, is huge, it's immense. There's this demographic profile that we keep talking about, and a number of people call it the demographic dividend. It's not yet a dividend, it might well be a dividend, but the demographic profile is huge. We are the youngest country in the world. We are also going to have the largest workforce in the world by 2050, if you believe the UN projections. So we're going to have 1 billion people in the labor force, 1 billion in the labor force, and 1.7 billion population. So that's the sort of magnitude, and we've got a huge informal sector, 90% of our workers in the informal sector, and yesterday Professor Uni provided documentation of that, and there's a lot of evidence already that the informal sector means you don't have any much access to social security, at least not within the firm. You can buy it in the market, but the execution of that or implementation of that is still up for grabs. So the background is a huge sort of informal sector, a large amount of underemployment, of course, to go with the unemployment. And we've been hearing since yesterday about the massive increases in youth unemployment and the massive increases to the labor force that is going to happen over the years. In the midst of all of this, in the backdrop of this, we have technology that threatens to sort of substitute. We've already had substitution, and I will show some of that during the talk. We've already had substitution by capital of labor. And this threatens to become even more pronounced or profound than it was. It threatens to, I'm not saying it will, but it threatens to become even more pronounced as entrepreneurs, capitalists move away from labor and into more capital deepening kind of techniques of production. So that's the background for this. And I'm going to sort of, these slides will be available, I guess, although they were ready just about an hour ago. They will be ready. So I'll skip through some of them and spend more time on some that I think are more relevant to the paper that I'm going to talk about. And this is, again, in the form of, in the spirit of completeness. We've had 4 industrial revolutions, and the point being that, so the first one characterized by steam, power, electricity, etc., assembly lines, those are the first 3. And then the fourth one, which is sort of particularly sort of all-encompassing because it cuts through the entire economy and production processes, is the artificial intelligence, and really builds on that dot-com sort of boom that we saw and a bust following it that we saw in the 90s. This builds on that, and you have this artificial intelligence, quantum computers, biotechnology, blockchain, etc., and 3D printing. And yesterday I was chairing a session in which Professor Awasthi said 3D printing is passé. It's now 4D printing, and 4D printing is also sort of self-correcting. So not only do you have 3D printing, but you also have 4D printing, which could potentially substitute many sort of workers, especially construction workers. So already between the time I prepared this and yesterday, I've learned something new, that there's a 4D printing which is also afoot. But AI is not new, and sort of it's at least been in existence since 1956. So AI is not new. It's been around, and we know that, you know, Kasparov played with, I don't know, Blue Thunder or whatever it was called, and there's been so many of sort of these ups and downs of AI in the past. There have been sort of many experiments also done with it, but this time is really different. And I'm sort of here quoting a book that was written sort of some years ago called The Globotics Revolution. And they say that this time is really different. And the reason it's really different this time, artificial intelligence, is because I think of 3 major reasons. One is that algorithms have become much more powerful. I mean, it's amazing what algorithms can do. They were powerful in the past, but now they've become even more powerful. The feedstock for AI is data. And data is available in abundance. You probably do not even know what kind of data is being captured on a daily basis. You forget the number of zeros and raised to the power, how much of data is being collected. Now, the point is that if data is being collected, I mean, some of it is used, some of it is not, you'll be surprised to know that 90% of the data that is collected is not used yet. So you can imagine if all 100% of the data that is collected begins to be used, what kind of inferences and forecasts, etc., we would be able to make, because algorithms, as I said, are becoming much more powerful. Adding to that, so there's algorithms, powerful, data which is available in abundance, and storage capacities and the power of the chip has multiplied, you know, immensely. Every 2 years it doubles, you know, that Moore's law. And that's been happening really at a rapid pace. So these 3 reasons suggest that AI of, you know, the past, when you had these booms and, you know, what you call these overshooting phenomena, has occurred in the past and then has sort of settled down and died or come back to the old equilibrium. This time, whether there's a new sort of a new equilibrium and all this hype will die down, one doesn't know. It seems it may not, and AI will become pervasive. Already it has become pervasive. And as an aside, you know, so AI is very powerful. It's going to change the way we do things, change the way we live. And computers can read, write, see, speak, understand speech, create visuals, output, and recognize facial patterns, etc., etc. You know all of that. Now you can get into the airports with DigiLocker, and you know your face gets scanned. You don't need to present an ID, etc. So all that is beginning to happen. Some of it is scary, but it will happen. It's inevitable that there will be advances in AI. Just as an aside, if you go back to the US-China trade war, I'm sort of trying to emphasize the sort of importance or the significance in a geopolitical sense of AI also. So just like there was a Star Wars, there was a race for AI that's still going on, and the United States is sort of felt that it was losing on the race to China because China had access to huge amounts of data without really being responsible or accountable to that data or what they were doing with that data. And so they felt they were losing the AI battle, and so that manifested itself in many ways, including in a trade war, including in several sort of, let me say this because this is I'm going to be a little provocative. Let me say this anyway. So it resulted in a number of self-serving arguments by the big tech in the United States that we should get access to data just like the Chinese do, without being sort of put in a framework of respecting privacy or a pigeonhole or of things that we can't do, so that we don't lose that AI battle to China. Of course, they were self-serving arguments, and they were made, and in the geopolitics of the world, including monopolies of the world, you hear these arguments. I say they are self-serving because, I mean, there is no way that access to data should be, in any case, unrestricted. But that's besides the point. The important point to take away for this sort of talk is that AI is so important that it is changing the way, not only the way firms behave, of course it is, but it's also changing the way countries engage, not only with each other, but also engage with the rest of the sort of world. Now, again, this is not a major sort of part of the talk, but just for sort of looking at what AI or technology could do, it could obviously displace, which is a narrative which is around, and I'll talk a little bit about that narrative. And it could also, expand, just like the previous industrial revolutions changed, improved efficiency, increased the size of the pie. There was much more to go around for everybody. Think about Malthus, think about productivity enhancements in agriculture, and there was much more to go around for everybody, and still some left over. So those are those countervailing forces, the deepening effect, which is particularly seen in Indian manufacturing and services, the reinstatement effect, the effect of new technologies in Ola and Uber, and there are several others, and I'll talk a little more about those technologies, which would then provide avenues for, I wouldn't say productive employment opportunities, but they would provide avenues for employment. And I'm keeping Professor Uni's talk yesterday in the background, whether you empower or not, or if you get agency or it's exploitative. So keeping that in your mind, jobs will be created naturally. Now, the question is whether, and the whole sort of premise of the paper I'm going to write is going to be, given the background of the huge number of entrants to the labor force, and given India's structural transformation, people moving out of agriculture, hopefully, notwithstanding what we saw yesterday of increase in agriculture, over time, I guess in a secular way, people will come out of agriculture. Will technology be able to absorb them? Or do we need to do something different and go to the plain old sort of development story that we as economists, we are so familiar with, which is the structural transformation that we have bypassed. But I'm going to sort of talk about that, and that is indeed the premise of this talk. So there are countervailing forces, no doubt about that, and there are sort of displacement also opportunities. So how do you contextualize the sort of, I'm calling it the Anglo-Saxon narrative just for ease, but it could be a narrative of any developed or mature market, which is seeing population decline, in some sense, aging population. So that's the perspective of this sort of argument. So, and this is much to do with the neoclassical liberal economics of the market, which is the market will deliver. And so we need not worry about the displacement effect, because new firms, new opportunities, new businesses will be created. All that you need to do is to ensure that the market works well. And if the market works well, you'll have this innovation, especially small and medium enterprises. New jobs will be created. There's no point protecting the middle class or protecting the middle-level jobs in the economy because it's futile to protect them. Even China is not being able to protect manufacturing jobs, and we've lost manufacturing jobs. Even in China, they're relocating. And all you need to do is therefore ensure free entry into the market and innovation, new technologies, the Silicon Valley, the Boston Route 128, etc. That will take care of job creation in these advanced economies. So that's a sort of, I'm calling it the Anglo-Saxon narrative, but that is a narrative, and which is the same narrative that sort of results in the huge job losses that were predicted for economies like India in, I think it was a decade ago, or less than a decade ago, I think 2016-17, they predicted that India would lose 67, or potential to lose 69% of its jobs, etc. But, and I'll come to that, but I think this argument has a lot of flaws, even for Anglo-Saxon economies, and definitely for emerging economies like India, and I'm going to focus on India. And the flaws with this argument, as Professor Deepak Nair so eloquently said yesterday in his opening remarks, that, you know, market failures happen all the time. In fact, I don't think there is any market that anywhere in the world, including in the most liberal, or the liberal the way we call it, not the way the Americans define it, but, you know, open markets, the Chicago markets, etc. Even those markets are subject to a lot of failure, and you can imagine India would be a lot, markets in India would be a subject to a lot of failure. So the whole point of MSMEs driving innovation, etc., and being able to create those jobs, be it in manufacturing or be it in services, I think is unlikely to happen, even if you have free entry, which we don't, but even if you had free entry, the market processes wouldn't work to encourage job creation in the Indian market. And even in the United States, I think there are, or I mean, I'm using the United States as we all do, I think, just as an example of describing sort of developed and mature economies much more, although sort of Europe tends to be a little more sort of interventionist than the United States. So why are these arguments flawed? I think for two reasons. One, markets don't work. And I think, and I'm happy to be challenged on that, but I think markets don't work efficiently in any country, let alone India. And two, the digital economy, which is sort of growing and becoming big, this market, or what the European Union has called conglomerization, is not a representation of market that is working efficiently and perfectly, because, I mean, there are so many externalities, you know, the whole idea of network effects. So you broke up an AT&T, Verizon, which was one of the baby bells in Washington, one of the baby bells that has now become one of the biggest firms in the world. Network effects will ensure that digital companies become very, very large. And I think that may not be a reason for being abusive or exploitative, but I think the tendency or the proclivity to be abusive, and there are lots of examples, and I will share some, but the whole point that they will encourage these big companies who become the gatekeepers, what Jimon called the platforms, they will become gatekeepers, they will sort of take a lot of money, as Jimon was saying yesterday. You know, you had this example in Gujarat where people were trying to register on the e-commerce website and then expand their market, scope of their market. Now, what happens there is that the cost of entry, the cost of registering could be as high as 70%. At least this is true in the telecom sector. When you wanted to put an app in the Airtel space, now of course you can do it differently, but you wanted to put an app in the Airtel space and you had an Airtel, and somebody wanted to reach out to Airtel customers or Vodafone customers, the gatekeeping function of these companies was such that they exploited. And it wasn't an easy entry. So, I mean, it went up all the way to the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, where I worked for a while. But the whole point is that the markets, there is some impediment in the efficient functioning of those markets. So what you expect neoliberal or classical Chicago economics to believe, or they will have you believe that markets, everything will work efficiently and governments will only screw up, and that you would get efficient outcomes. Maybe in the long run, Schumpeter will work, but in the short run, it's unlikely. And by the time, if you don't intervene, it could be too late. So while I think that digital technology, etc., has the benefits that we're talking about, one has to be careful. And this is just one representation size. Today, if you place the big 5 tech companies in the world and sort of insert the GDP of countries, the big 5 tech companies, not by market value, by asset value, because markets have a tendency to inflate, by asset value, they would be amongst the largest country in the world, probably, definitely in the top 10, maybe 6th or 7th. And that's the power of these big companies. So Raghuram Rajan has written an article from Chicago calling it Zuigi Zingalis, Raghuram Rajan, calling out the kill zone. And this has happened in the past. IBM has done it in the past. They have acquired companies that threatened their position as market leaders and suppressed innovation. This is not new. And I don't think this tendency is going to be eschewed. Show me a monopoly that is benign, and I will sort of stop doing the thing I like best to do. So the point then becomes, in this environment where free entry is difficult, will, the kind of entry and exit of MSMEs will be able to create those kind of jobs that we want India to be able to create? And I think the answer is a resounding no, it won't happen. Maybe it will happen in more mature markets, but we do need to somehow protect. I mean, this is the narrative that you don't protect these middle-level jobs. And these middle-level jobs or low-level jobs that I'm thinking about in India in the terms of a trade framework is abundant supply of low-skilled labor needs productive employment opportunities. And the question that I'm asking, or this paper will ask with the help of all the people that I've named, is will services or will the innovation provide for them? And I think the hypothesis that I already know the answer, but and you would have judged that by what I'm saying, it is difficult for that to happen. So somehow, so what is the kind of protection or what is the kind of incentive? By protection, I don't mean raise, tariff barriers and give them protection and so on. That's not the kind of protection I'm talking about. It's obviously what are the incentives, what is the industrial policy that would be necessary to be able to create those productive jobs, because it's unlikely that the services sector will be able to absorb the kind of magnitude of the numbers of people that are coming into the workforce in India. And, there's another part of this literature on market failure, and the reason I'm saying this is because there's some forgotten economists that have worked on this, and I think in the whole sort of this bandwagon of neoclassical economics, these economists tend to have been forgotten. Oliver Williamson, Jensen and Meckling, the agency cost, saying that, all markets work well, right, including market for managers. Excuse me. But market for managers also don't work well. And what is the relevance of that here? Well, the managers of these big firms. The neoclassical hypothesis is bad managers decline in market value, they'll be thrown out, and they'll be replaced by good managers. Does that happen? Is the market for managers, the market for managerial control working well? Does it work well even in advanced countries? And the answer is no. It doesn't work well. So if managers of these firms are not working in shareholder interest and they are not being thrown out, are they taking decisions that maximize shareholder wealth? Are they taking decisions that maximize efficiency or welfare? And the jury is still out there, but I think the answer will be a resounding no, because if you can vote for salary increases to yourself in a board and give yourself salaries that are, 30,000 times the median salary, I'm talking about these big firms, then you wonder whether these markets are working efficiently or not. So there is the market for managers, and the reason, the way I'm connecting this is this paper from the European Union, which came out, I think, a few years ago, in which they documented that the amount of money that the big tech, big five spend on acquisitions, some of them are acquisitions to thwart innovation, etc. They buy a firm a month. Each of these big five, I'm not naming them, but you know who I'm talking about, they buy a firm a month. And this is, old data before pre-COVID. I don't know the sort of recent statistics or the numbers, but there's huge amounts of acquisition. You could turn around and say that, yes, well, I want to be bought because I'm creating innovation, I'm being bought, and I want to be bought. But the other point is these firms are becoming big. They are influencing the economy in ways that you cannot even imagine, including thwarting innovation, including preventing the market from working efficiently. And these managers sort of are part of that entire system of market failure. So that's sort of the broad argument that I want to make. And I'll obviously refine this in the paper that I do. But that's the broad argument that I wish to make. Now, I've said this, that digital firms are changing. They are expanding because of network effects, and I've showed you this. But what is the relevance for India? And there's a lot of literature that I have read in labor markets or labor literature in India and of India, which basically says, including Professor Ghosh, that a lot of these technological advancements that have occurred in an exogenous sense. India is not a creator of technology right now. We may well become in the future, we may well become producers of technology. And I'm not talking about, mimicry or this is talking about fundamental technology, basic technology. And we've borrowed, adapted, and sometimes not adapted. And that technology is not necessarily relevant to the country or relevant to India. But there is one technology that is relevant to India. And let me mention the G word that has not been mentioned in this seminar yet, which is the G20, when you see G20. And in the G20, India is proposing to carpet bomb sort of, at least the emerging markets, with this technology that is being developed in-house in India called, and I'm not mentioning carpet bombing in a negative sense, this is in a very positive way. I think Rakesh mentioned that Mr. Papola was given to sort of sense of humor, and I hope you take it as that. So this is this innovation that has emerged in India. It's called digital public infrastructure, the India stack that has made this, and I think there's a lot of good in that technology, but that technology is relevant to India, created in India, and can have a lot of benefits for India. Those sorts of technologies are few and far between. And therefore, when we adapt exogenous technology, it often comes at the cost of displacing labor or not creating enough employment opportunities. And now DPI has, this digital public infrastructure has a lot of benefits. Yes, there is, and new platforms are coming up called ONDC, which will also have a lot of benefits. And if you sort of just hark back a little bit on the things that I said about big tech, etc. Now, one of the ways to control big tech is to break them up, cease and desist kind of things, or to tell them, you can't do this and I'm going to penalize you. And we've seen the history of antitrust in Europe, in United States, the huge fines, give your software open source. And, it's been difficult to rein in big tech, either by, financial penalties or by breaking up structural remedies or conduct remedies. It's been very difficult to do that across the world. DPI or ONDC provides an opportunity for the small firms to, at very little cost, become a part of the digital system. And that's why I think DPI and ONDC type of technological innovations are important not only for India, but for the rest of the world. But I'm using DPI as an example of a homegrown, relevant technology which may have sort of applications elsewhere as well, but it has also the ability to create innovation and therefore create what I think is the most challenging sort of policy challenge of our times. It is creation of productive jobs. And it could do that, and you've seen fintech do that. Of course, it can't provide an answer to that. So, and these sort of, so that is a sort of a ray of hope, I think, for India and other emerging markets. Remember, mobile money didn't originate in the West. Mobile money, if you look at the history, it was largely driven by Kenya, and there was a sort of gap in the market which Safaricom came in and became a bank, a mobile bank, and that innovation then spread to a large number of countries. Now it's the norm in India. Can you imagine that, you can go around India all over the country and buy even a pan or a cigarette at paying by Paytm or whatever, by a fintech app. So, and that has huge benefits. And that is an innovation that is helping efficiency, providing employment, all of it for the informal small enterprises as well. And that's why I say that it is so relevant for the country. Of course, data is not available, which is what this paper will try and do. The other thing, and this is, I've already said this is what Professor Uni was saying yesterday about these platforms, these huge apps. Any of these apps are multi-sided platforms. They have a demand side, they have a supply side. They sort of intermediate what Professor Uni was calling the shared economy. Now, the million-dollar question, and she also said the jury is still out there, and I think it is still out there, is do they provide agency or are they exploitative? Now, think about it. Extreme examples are meant only to illuminate rather than to generalize. So, my brother lives in the United States, and he's now here, and he often tells me that we are ordering stuff, grocery, and it arrives at home in 5 minutes, sometimes 7 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes. You can get all your groceries online, and it's like it's less time than you would go out, step out to the market, and come back home if a market was located close by. He's saying this is amazing. I mean, this is efficiency multiplied many times over, and it would be difficult to have such an arrangement in the United States. Of course, there's ample supply of low-skilled labor with bikes who can move about the city. But if you ask these people, and this is in the mode of Professor Uni, is this the kind of work that you would like to do? Is this creation of productive employment opportunities? And I don't know what the answer will be, but I guess it will be difficult to justify this as a sustainable livelihoods for a large section of the population. But this is what it is doing. So is it exploitative, or is this giving them agency? You could think, you could have answers for both, but these are the questions that one will have to grapple with when we talk about job creation or productive job creation. So what's the empirical evidence on Rakesh, how much time? Okay. So what's the empirical evidence that we have on, so what's happened with technology and digitalization in India, in manufacturing and services largely, and to some extent in agriculture as well. I'll give you sort of, this is different sort of papers come up with a different conclusion, but I'm going to sort of give a very general argument of what I think many of the papers are saying. Data is a huge constraint. What has technology done in manufacturing, in services? Agriculture, there's not so much work on agriculture, but largely for manufacturing and services. What is the current state of discussion or job creation in these sectors as a result of technology? And the answer is not completely negative. I mean, you have to bring in the inequality debate when you begin to talk about technology, AI in services and manufacturing. You have to bring in the... but the first point that, I remember when the president of the World Bank was in Bangladesh in 2015 or 16 it was, he didn't come to India and make the statement, but he said that 69% of India's manufacturing jobs were at risk, and I think everybody got very, very alarmed at that statement that so many jobs are at risk. Now, that was the early literature on displacement, early literature where you looked at a job being completely displaced by technology, and of course the literature has has become a little more sophisticated when you don't talk about complete job losses, but you talk about tasks, and the job may not be lost, and you would be doing better tasks, or a part of what you do would be replaced by capital or by robots and so on. So that literature has become a little more sophisticated, and I think it's not as alarmist, so there will be displacement. But what has happened in India, if you look at the background again, that large supply of low-skilled, relatively less educated people, so India having a comparative advantage, as it were, in labor-intensive, low labor-intensive production, which is really manufacturing as we know it in the past, textiles, toys, leather, gems, jewelry, etc. Sectors that we haven't done too well in. We've done well, but we haven't done too well in, and that's really cutting to the chase of what I'm going to say at the end. But the anxieties were, in some sense, there was overshooting of the Don Bush kind, or some people call it the gut overestimates the impact. I mean, you fear the worst of technology coming in. There was an overestimation of job losses, but I think also it was due to sort of researching or not doing the research as well as one could. So there would be specific tasks, and then the question that has been answered, in fact, I think by Radhika as well, and there's another paper by Pankaj Vashisht, who used to be at ICREER, now at RIS, who says that, you know, just because you have a technology doesn't mean that you're going to adopt it. And here, again, I think there is a vast amount of literature around, you know, how technologies, so standards get set, or technologies set standards, and sometimes better technologies are unable to break through because of markets. You know, think about your VHS video cassettes. I mean, eventually they were displaced by CDs, and CDs got displaced by, you know, USBs, and USBs will get displaced by clouds, etc. All that sort of creative destruction will happen, but sometimes better technologies will not get adapted or adopted because they don't have a market, or they are not useful or relevant to the country. So just because a technical solution exists doesn't mean that it will be adopted. And I think that's pretty much what we see in some of the papers. So what has happened in India over this period, when this literature really starting in, you know, the early 2000s up to 2017, 18, pre-COVID, there's no data post-COVID, but largely what it shows is that technical progress has been skilled biased, right? And it's been skilled. So there's been increasing employment. The rate of growth of wages in the skill biased sectors has been larger. It's not that there's been a hollowing out. It's not that the middle sort of skill level people have lost jobs, but their jobs haven't grown at the same rate. Their wages haven't grown at the same rate as the wages of high skilled, and low skilled wages haven't grown at all or have been stagnant, but the number of people, as Ramesh Chand was saying yesterday, the number of people employed may have increased, but the technical progress and the structural transformation has been pretty much skilled biased. There's very little evidence of displacement, as it were, in the literature that I have read. And even in the work that Radhika has done, if you see the number of robots in India, they haven't drastically changed over time. Industries which employed robots continue to employ robots, and this is before the digital revolution or AI came in. Precision industries, when you talk about, you know, maybe automobile industry or medical equipment. So robots were there and continue to be there. India is, in fact, the most recent data I have, 3 robots per 1,000 or whatever. So per 10,000. So India is the lowest intensity of robotification, if you will, in the manufacturing sector in India. So I think the fear, the anxiety is natural, it's subjective, but I think it's overplayed. That is the sense that I get from the literature, is that, and this is sort of standard fare in all of the literature, that ICT applied to manufacturing, it's mostly physical, and a bit of information and a bit of communications, and in services, it is more of information and more of communication. So obviously, Digitech is all ICT, but applied to manufacturing and applied to services. In manufacturing, it is less so, it is a lot more physical, and in services, of course, it is a lot more information and communications. Now, the point I wish to make here is that so India's job conundrum or job challenge, and cutting to almost to the conclusion, is that services will drive India's takeoff, which historically in East Asia has been driven by manufacturing, and services will drive India's takeoff. There are people who seriously think, and that includes servicification of manufacturing, right? I mean, but servicification of manufacturing is largely limited to very high-end, skilled, biased kind of employment opportunities in the manufacturing. It's design, and some of it may be logistics as well. But by itself, services cannot substitute for a manufacturing-led takeoff of the kind we've seen in the literature empirically in Japan, in Korea, and most recently in China. And I think as a person who's worked on policy for several years, I can't but help think that, PLI is sort of the production-linked incentive, but there are lots of other problems in India about manufacturing beyond, incentive, beyond subsidies, and beyond labor laws, which are always easy to make a culprit or make a victim in this analysis. I mean, the whole host of all the ingredients of the ease of doing business are sort of staring at us as impediments in becoming a manufacturing powerhouse. And to an extent, the sort of bypass of that manufacturing is because of the difficulty of doing business when I was in ICRIR, we did work with the Chinese, and the Chinese wanted to work on India's services sector, and they said, why don't some of your researchers work on our manufacturing sector? So it was a nice combination. We worked on their manufacturing, they worked on our services. The conclusion of that big project between researchers in ICRIR and researchers in China was India's services industry grew because by the time rules and regulations were able to be made or wanted to be made, the industry had grown very big by itself. So, what James Bond will call happenstance, or whatever. It just happened, historical accident, in the words of Paul Krugman. So, historical accident happened, and services grew because there was no government, almost no government intervention in that. But manufacturing wasn't the beneficiary of that. We've come out of the license Raj, etc., and you could trace that back. But it hasn't been able to deliver the large-scale employment opportunities for labor-intensive production for the low and relatively less educated of India. And if we don't do that, I don't think this takeoff will happen. This takeoff is not going to happen. It cannot happen by supplying labor to developed countries that are sort of seeing the absence of people to do low-skilled jobs. But I don't think movement of labor is as easy as movement of goods or even online services. So that's not going to happen. We'll have to find solution within the country. And I don't see, having sort of been in this space for a bit, I don't see a solution of just services or services on manufacturing. The solution has to be on labor-intensive manufacturing. And the world population is not, it's still growing, 9 billion people by 2050. So people will want to eat, people will want to, buy clothes, people will wear shoes. There is still, I don't buy this argument that markets are being closed to manufacturing of the sort of labor-intensive kind. Those markets still exist. Yes, they probably won't need as much labor as they have in the past, but still they will require labor-intensive techniques of production. So that's the sort of major, and I've said all this, so I'm not going to belabor these points. And the only other thing that I wish to say is that inequality will be a part of the paper that I do, which is the skill bias, technical change that I've spoken about. I haven't spoken, I've sort of represented from the literature. But I think you can't talk about India and skill bias, technical progress without talking about inequality. So that is another issue that needs to be addressed. And part of the inequality is because we haven't been able to create enough productive jobs in the labor-intensive manufacturing sector. So returns to capital and returns to labor, I think, have been in favor of capital, although there's some evidence that is coming through that now the return to capital is somewhat, that gap is narrowing, but the gap is still there. And therefore, we need to, strengthen our competitiveness and our capability. It's no easy task, but these are all motherhood statements, schooling, ASA reports, etc. So I'm not going to, go through that pain of saying that. I mean, pain you. I could say it, but I don't want to pain you. You already know this, that, education, schooling, vocational, etc. All that has to be a part of the solution. Creating special economic zones for labor-intensive production, for textiles, toys, gems and jewelry won't be the answer, and will not be an answer without having, labor to be able to work in those factories. And I think that's what's going to happen. And from ILO, given the sort of magnitude of the jobs problem that we have, we also need to create a sort of a social safety net. I don't know what form it would take, but we need to create a social safety net. Otherwise, the kinds of demonstrations that we've seen in Gujarat, the patidars, if you remember, the reservations for jobs in Rajasthan by the Jats and Haryana, the recent Agnipath stirs in Bihar, and the obsession for government jobs in UP, and I think people have spoken about that. Those are a reflection of the underlying structural problem of lack of job creation. And I think government is now no longer the employer of last resort. That function it has given up many years ago. So government cannot be an employer of last resort. There shouldn't be an employer of last resort, but it will be up to the private sector to be able to solve India's job problems. And I think within that, manufacturing. Thank you for listening to me. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Rajat, for discussing this issue of technology and employment on a very broad canvas. And what Rajat brought out very clearly is that the relationship between technology and employment is a function of many other factors, including the way policies are crafted, what happens to market imperfections, what happens to managerial hubris, and so on. So the issue of linking technology with employment is much more complex, and one has to look at it in a much broader way. I just want to add two points, which are in some sense subsets of what Rajat has already spoken about. I don't work in this area, but I have been very closely associated with startups, which are technology driven. And purely from the perspective of some of the startups that I have seen in recent times, I want to raise two questions with respect to this relationship. One question is that of temporality. Somehow we don't ask this question, if technology of this kind is coming in, how much time will it take to affect employment? I'll give you one example. A company that we supported has created a bot which can be used by sales workers when they are talking to their potential clients. And this bot tells the sales worker what to say based on the conversation that's going on, right? So at one level, you are saying bot is replacing the sales worker. At another level, you can say that the employers now can hire people who do not have the cognitive skills to understand the conversation and take the decision or discussion forward based on that understanding, because the bot is providing that kind of input or insight. Now, this kind of an idea, many companies are therefore hiring people who do not the same kind of high cognitive skills, but decent skills of sales work, which can be complemented by this bot and do a very good sales kind of a job. And this kind of a phenomenon reminds me of the days when IT-related technologies helped us move from on-site to off-site work, and that led to significant deepening of the labor market in the IT labor market, because lots and lots of people who were not as skilled to go to the US and do on-site jobs were able to get absorbed in this IT labor market at different levels of skills. So one can potentially look at these new technologies as mechanisms which might help deepen the market, where people with different skills and capabilities may be able to get absorbed in the emerging labor market. So that's one point that I wanted to flag. The other point which comes to mind is that this whole discussion about employment and technology somehow gets focused so much on AI and ML. And so there are so many other technologies that are being developed which may have significant impact on employment. So once again, going to our portfolio companies, there is one company which is able to use satellite images and tell the fishermen where to go to fish. Now, otherwise they are spending their time inefficiently, and not all of them can go because they know that fish in certain areas is not so much available, so fewer fishermen will go. This company tells you that this is the location where there's a lot of fishes there, so more people can go and fish, right? So not only your efficiency of fishing goes up, but more fishermen can get employed on that particular day in that particular area. And the same company is able to use satellite images to tell you what kind of sea farming you can do in which area, right? So it opens up a completely new avenue of employment, which can be used by people to go farm under the sea for different kinds of crops. One more example, lot of companies are trying to come up with technologies in agriculture which do not require as much water, right? Whether it is using sensors or whether it is varieties which don't use so much water. As soon as you have those kinds of varieties, there is a possibility of getting jobs in agriculture, which is considered to be not so great these days, but which can give you productive employment, primarily because earlier irrigation was not available and you could not grow certain kinds of crops, but with these new technologies you are able to. Of course, there are some technologies which have the problem which Rajat just pointed out. They are technically feasible, they are still to be economically feasible, but we are getting there. So the point which I'm trying to make is that one needs to think about the time it will take for the new technologies to start affecting employment, what is the nature of employment that will be affected, and what can we do to mitigate those ill effects if there are any, and can we move away from only platforms, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and move and start looking at other technologies that are being developed and think about in what way those technologies can add to employment growth. I don't know, we have time for questions? Okay. So thank you very much for your patience, and thank you, Rajat, for a very enlightening lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Kathuria and Professor Rakesh. This was just an engaging session. Thank you so much.